you're on Initiative Africa. My name is Asha Sampath. Welcome to your weekly magazine featuring Africa on the move through smart innovations and initiatives that work. In this new edition, we raise the question of nature conservation on the continent. Let's get on with the show with our top stories today. COP27 has ended, but the IUCN's fight continues for the protection of nature. We meet Charles Karangwa, a specialist in land restoration and sustainable agriculture at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, who is fighting to promote nature-based solutions adapted to combat climate change. He's our guest this week.
IUCN is a global authority on conservation, and we are probably the largest network of conservation organizations across the world.
A survivor of sexual abuse reaches out to men who are themselves victims of violence. Listening and therapy for all genders is Halima's Layene's mission in Nigeria.
What we do when we go out to talk to men is we pretty much talk about emotional stability. We try to normalize, the idea of expressing yourself, the idea of seeking help.
Putting an end to decades of agro-pastoral conflicts. This is a reality that is beginning to take hold in Togo, thanks to the mediation of local chiefs and the involvement of the country's leaders.
C'est le conflit foncier qui est toujours cité en premier lieu. Donc cela voudrait dire que c'est la source des problèmes dans la région des savanes.
In Nigeria, a young woman who survived sexual abuse found the strength to teach other victims how to overcome this ordeal. Her foundation, Life After Abuse, strives for a better social awareness of sexual violence and the post-traumatic convalescence of victims. Halima Layene focused her attention on marginalized teenagers to whom she offered listening sessions and therapy. She then realized that young men who were victims of abuse needed more adapted therapy. Our correspondent in Abuja, Hugo Yuana, followed her to understand her approach.
The patriarchal nature of the African society over the years have prevented men from speaking out and opening up to therapy when they experience any form of psychological trauma. According to a 2021 report by the Lagos State Domestic and Sexual Violence Response Team, DSVRT, 194 men were reportedly assaulted by their partners from January to June 2021, recording a slight increase from 108 cases reported the first 6 months of the previous year. The narrative seems to be shifting as Life After Abuse Foundation is bringing the needed change.
I didn't grow up in the midst of this loving, happy family. I grew up in the midst of fight, curses, war, a lot of anger. Really piles of anger, unforgiveness and all sorts. So I never even always had good intentions for anyone growing up.
Some time ago, I lost my mom, and dealing with it was very difficult. I mean, for a very long period of time, I could not process it. I was emotionless, I was expressionless. A lot of people were actually confused relating with me.
We've counseled men who have been through sexual abuse. We've also counseled men who have suffered parental, physical, and emotional abuse. We try to create that safe space for men, and we try to, encourage men that it's okay to cry. It's okay to talk about your feelings or your emotions. So we set up something called a love counseling platform where men can gain access to a one-on-one counseling. What we do when we go out to talk to men is we pretty much talk about emotional stability. We try to normalize, the idea of expressing yourself, the idea of seeking help. We try to acknowledge the trauma that they've gone through. We know that, traditionally men are required to hold a lot of things in.
I'm actually happy that I found a refuge, a safe place called love.
After the therapy sessions, after the counseling, I just found that I was more enthusiastic about my job. Before then, I just saw my job as a responsibility, something I had to wake up and do.
We basically believe that a more sustainable approach to any gender-based violence is actually reorienting men, basically, rehabilitating them. Started educating men on women's rights, emotional stability, consent, and all of that. We launched the campaign and we had men from across 4 African countries, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Benin Republic, and Nigeria joining on the movement. And the movement actually attracted a lot of attention, and we had, I think our volunteer platform grew from 60 to 480, and we had, a lot of members joining to advocate for it. One of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is actually good health and well-being, and that is what we try to focus on in LAF. We know that the issue of men's mental health actually falls under that category, and we try to focus on that. And we're able to at least reach 6,000 men in 4 African countries. In 2020, LAF gained global recognition through a platform called the United Nations Youth Solutions Report, and we emerged a finalist. Also through our work, we have been able to get an award from the United States government through a fellowship called the Karangwa Youth Fellowship Initiative for the work that we do regarding the SDG 3.
This raises hope that more women in Africa will be able to engage in similar social work, with an ultimate goal to encourage males to open up and embrace counseling without being ashamed for it.
It is a unique organization that has been bringing together states, government agencies, hundreds of NGOs, as well as thousands of experts and scientists for decades. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has helped more than 75 countries in the application of their conservation and biological diversity strategies. Africa, which each year loses up to 350 million hectares of land due to soil degradation, is a major source for the IUCN, as Charles Karangwa, one of its officials, shared with me. I met him on the sidelines of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Charles Karangwa, hello. Welcome on Initiative Africa. So you are regional head of land systems covering forests, drylands and sustainable agriculture at the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Africa region. Could you tell us about the role and mission of the IUCN?
Thank you. IUCN is a global authority on conservation, and we are probably the largest network of conservation organizations across the world. And most of our work really spans through 4 components: conserving nature, of course, people, livelihoods, alternatives, and equity and rights, which is part of governance work we do. And we also have quite a lot of work around biodiversity from both terrestrial and marine ecosystems in Africa, and mostly also working with governments to transition towards sustainable and climate resilience development.
What about the work of IUCN in Africa?
So IUCN in Africa have probably for many decades been supporting conservation agenda. And over the last 30 years, we have been mostly focusing on work on what we call sustainable conservation, which basically includes issues around development. So you are basically looking at drivers of deforestation and habitat loss, and by addressing them, then you basically respond to conservation challenges. So our work in Africa, we have about 4 major programs. One is focusing on what we call protected area and conserved area. And here it's really institutional capacity development for governments, protected area managers to be able to sustainably manage, conserve biodiversity. The second is on what we call terrestrial land management ecosystems. And this spans around basically forest, agriculture, drylands, resilience, water systems management, which basically helps also institutions, communities to sustainably manage and invest in those ecosystems in a way that, of course, both are sustainable but also are productive, because these are the resources that people depend on every day. The third element of our work in Africa is around marine and the coastal resilience. We have experienced over the last decade huge changes in marine ecosystem management, disasters, flooding, which is really hugely costing the continent a lot in terms of resources. And what we are trying to do is really to increase sustainable management of the coastal area, but also the marine, so which includes also plastic pollution in the marine areas, waste management and the likes. And then finally, of course, is our work on policy and institutional capacity development across the continent. So that's where we are working in Africa.
Could you talk about nature-based solutions? What are they, and how can they benefit the African continent in the fight against climate change?
Yeah, thank you. I think over the last couple of years, we have seen actually a huge interest in nature-based solutions. And last year, actually early this year in April, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, UNEA 5, endorsed the definition of nature-based solutions as basically actions to restore, protect and conserve nature, all type of ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, marine ecosystems. And that was actually an official way and a call to action for governments to start adopting nature-based solutions. And you can also talk about biodiversity loss at the same time. You look at the drivers of biodiversity loss and wonder, how do you put something together which can address both climate change from adaptation and mitigation, but also biodiversity loss in many ways. The nature-based solutions is probably one of the best way, because you are talking about not one solution. You're talking about the solutions based on nature. And in Africa, of course, I will speak from, let's take an example of energy. When we talk about renewable energy, you are mostly relying on a number of sources, right? You are talking about the wind, transitioning to wind, to solar, to other renewables. And most of this really depends on nature. Now, how do you really build nature to be able to give you that renewable energy you're looking for? An example is a hydropower plant. If you don't protect a catchment upstream, and you're building a huge hydroelectricity power plant downstream, what happens is you lose the investment because you are not protecting the catchment. And the way you protect catchment, you are using the nature-based solutions. You are managing land sustainably, you are increasing vegetation cover, you are protecting soil erosions, you are basically investing in nature so that nature can give you the services.
Welcome back to the second part of our show. Agro-pastoral conflicts are still numerous in sub-Saharan Africa and each year cause thousands of deaths and injuries. In Togo, in the Savane region bordering Burkina Faso, farmers and herders have clashed for decades for access to pasture and water. Yet today, thanks to the mediation of local chiefs but also to the involvement of leaders at the national and regional level, peace has returned to the region. An agreement has been reached between herders and farmers to live in peace and harmony. Take a look.
Quand moi je suis arrivé, lui, il était avec les bêtes dans le champ en train de manger. Les bêtes mangent, lui, il est à côté, il les regarde. Quand je suis arrivé, je lui demande, devant toi là, tu vois, c'est quoi là-bas? Et puis, c'est comme ça. C'est là-bas qu'il m'a tapé. Dans un de mes villages vers l'ouest, à Pétila, les bouviers sont rentrés dans le champ et c'est un maraîcher qui a fait les tomates. Il a fait ça sur un bon espace et c'est de ça qu'il vit. Bon, dans un premier temps, quand il est retourné sous l'effet de colère, il avait le coucou. Il y avait un petit taureau qui était là, il a haché carrément. Et le bouvier a sorti son coucou. Ils se sont pris, hein, ils se sont pris. Il y a eu du sang qui a coulé.
Il y avait un climat vraiment conflictuel dans beaucoup de localités. Et on a constaté, ou bien on a vu une violence de grande ampleur dans la préfecture, dans un village de la préfecture de Thone, où des communautés entre Moba se sont affrontées entre les peuls bouviers et les autochtones gourmandiers, où il y a eu également même des morts, hein, des morts d'hommes. Il y a eu les cases brûlées.
Nous sommes arrivés ici, on a voulu essayer de les interroger. Le bouvier, il ne voulait même pas obtempérer pour qu'on voie comment ça a commencé, pour voir à la solution. Il dit que les bœufs étaient tellement nombreux que lui seul ne pouvait pas d'un seul coup les faire sortir.
C'est le conflit foncier qui est toujours cité en premier lieu. Donc cela voudrait dire que c'est la source des problèmes dans la région des savanes.
Quand il a vu son taureau avec les coucous que le jeune, et là, lui, il est gardien. Qu'est-ce que lui va signaler? Qu'est-ce qu'il va dire à son chef qu'il a demandé? Lui, on n'a qu'à lui dire ce que ça coûte. Et le jeune dit non, lui dire ce que ça coûte. Il faut que moi, en tant que chef, il faut que j'aille moi-même voir.
Oui, on devrait faire la paix. S'il a pu payer pour les champs, là c'est fini. Tu les laisses partir. Lorsqu'il n'a pas payé si le champ, l'affaire est toujours là-bas.
Là, il a fait une facture de 345 000 au bouvier. Et nous aussi, nous sommes rentrés dedans, on a concilié en demandant pardon aux jeunes, jusqu'à ce qu'ils soient entendus. Et il a donné 95 000 plus 10 000 francs pour aller se soigner. Je ne s'est pas arrêté là-bas, j'ai appelé le président des Peuls. Je lui ai expliqué la situation qui a prévalu dans le village à Agpéi. Lui, il a essayé d'appeler tous ceux-là qui opèrent chez nous ici. Ils sont venus des délégations de chaque village. Et depuis ce jour, ils ont décidé de ne jamais se promener avec les couteaux. Si tu es là, il est bouvier actuellement, quand vous les voyez aux gens, ils n'ont plus les couteaux sur eux, mais plutôt les bâtons. Rares sont ceux-là qui tiennent les couteaux.
Au niveau des cantons, cet organe est appelé Conseil des sages de prévention et de gestion des conflits fonciers. Leur rôle consiste à faire la prévention et le règlement des conflits.
La médiation, la conciliation, elle reste le seul moyen pacifique. Parce que tout le monde ne comprend pas que la gendarmerie peut aussi concilier. Mais puisque c'est un corps habillé, l'on peut partir facilement de la gendarmerie en prison. Donc nous pensons que la chefferie est un moyen beaucoup plus pacifique pour la médiation lorsqu'il y a conflit entre peuple, agriculteurs et bouviers.
Généralement, nous réussissons à concilier les parties. Lorsque les parties sont conciliées, nous débouchons sur une entente qui peut promouvoir la paix en famille, la paix au village, la paix entre les communautés.
Let's get back to the second part of the interview of Charles Karangwa from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Among other things, he speaks about nature-based solutions, which are ways to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modify ecosystems promoted by his organization, and how they can help Africa. Let's find out. Do you have some concrete examples of IUCN's work in Africa about these nature-based solutions?
I want to do that, yeah. One example, I have been working over the last 4 or 5 years on a program which is funded by the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs through their embassy in Rwanda, where we invested in protecting an 18,000 hectare of catchment. Let me tell you a story about this catchment. This is a catchment which historically, at least every single year, about 100 people's lives were being lost because of landslides, because of floods. Huge losses from infrastructure, including bridge, roads, were being destroyed because upstream was not protected. And during the heavy rain, Rwanda is a country of 1,000 hills, so you have a very high slope of 60%. And when it rains, because of the type of the soil and the construct of the landscape, there is always that whole landslide. I remember witnessing a time when a family of 8 people completely got exterminated because of a landslide, a heavy landslide. So we invested in that through different natural and nature-based solutions approach, including, of course, restoration of that catchment, protecting the river, increasing the size of where the river can flow, but also doing some other terracing of mountains to reduce the intensity of water. And I was very pleased early this month to speak with the mayor of the city of Rubavu in the western of Rwanda, saying, for the first time in 5 years, we have not lost a life, we have not lost a road, we have not lost a house, we have the normal rains. It was a very good to hear that story. So nature-based solution works. With that project, we created 60,000 jobs, green jobs, for very, very poor households that have been able to work, to restore, to protect the land, and they were paid as part of the ecosystem service benefits.
What about forest landscape restoration in Africa? Agriculture is a major driver of degradation due to land conversion. How can we reconcile restoration with agriculture and farming?
One of the unfortunate challenge people face in Africa is that they think agriculture should compete with forest. But that's not true, because historically Africa lived and survived on land, people survived on farming without necessarily destroying nature. I think there is a whole pressure and misconception of agricultural sector, thinking that expansion and expanding is going to be giving us more food security, but actually it's worsening the food security for many reasons, and that's probably one of the factors that we need to address in Africa when we talk about forest landscape restoration. And since agriculture is a huge driver of deforestation, the major investment we are making in Africa is really agroforestry systems. Investing in agroforestry, basically trees mixed with the crops, because then you are increasing vegetation cover and forest cover, but also you are reducing soil erosion and increasing the soil carbon matter by just mixing trees and the crops at the same time on farm. But also, we are encouraging farmers to not just expand agriculture, but sustainably manage the land they have by increasing regenerative agriculture on farm. And then finally, of course, it's restoring what has been already lost and try to invest in protecting what is still intact by not expanding agricultural area further.
Wood burning for heating and cooking is a major source of emissions and a health hazard for many. Some populations don't have many options, and it's sometimes a cultural choice. What can be done here?
I think that's very right. In terms of numbers, 85% of Africans use firewood for cooking and heating the house, and lighting. Even in some communities, they still use even firewood for lighting in the house. So it's a very useful resources, and that's one of the major drivers. If you go to countries like Malawi, the major driver in addition to agriculture is of course use of charcoal and firewood. But do we have alternatives? I think you can't turn this situation around for just in a year or 2 years or 3 years. You need to find how do we start investing in other options that can help reduce the biomass use at household level. There's a number of options that are being explored in many countries. IUCN is working on a number of projects in Rwanda, in Malawi, in Kenya, for example, to support communities access low fuel use cooking stoves, what we call improved cooking stoves. You still use biomass, you still use charcoal, you still use wood, but you don't use the same quantity as what you could use in a normal traditional stoving. That's very important. The second, we are investing significantly in technologies. IUCN is supporting, for example, different countries in Africa to study carefully alternative or what we call improved biomass technologies, but also green charcoal. And the third option we are investing in is what we call sustainable forest management techniques, increase the forest productivity. Now, if you want to reduce deforestation, you increase the forest productivity by improving forest management. And that's one of the areas we are investing in as an organization, to basically try to increase forest productivity and then increase the cubic meter of biomass per hectare, then reduce a complete degradation of existing forests, especially natural forests.
Climate and energy transition are critical for everyone and the planet as well. How do you see progress in this field on the continent, knowing that pathways for a just net zero transition must reflect African realities and ambitions? How can we make sure to guide fair and effective policy decisions? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, good question. One of the contentious topic in the COP here is, of course, Africa is a less contributor to emissions, right? So you're talking about less than 3% globally. And if you ask Africa to transition to green energy, there might be a mixed feeling of, okay, in any case, we are not emitting a lot, but why do we want to change from our coal to, why do you want us to close our coal to go to other renewable, sustainable energy? So I think it's an interesting topic for discussion, but I would provide a real situation here. No one would ever wish Africa to be where Europe and China and other developed countries are today. We would want to prevent to be there, right? So we would want to invest in sustainable energy now than just waiting until the situation is worse. So I guess that's where policies need to change. And we are seeing a lot of interest of the continent in Africa of change and just transition to sustainable and renewable energies. But of course, it's not something that can just happen overnight, right? Africa needs more time. I think Africa has a huge opportunity for sustainable energy. We are a continent with many sources of hydro rivers, huge potential. We can develop and serve the entire world with our rivers, with hydro, but also solar. But I guess what is needed is those resources, financial resources, to transition to those opportunities and to tap into the natural ecosystem services that we have and embrace that sustainable energy transition.
Well, Initiative Africa is over for today. You can, of course, find Charles Karangwa's interview and the replay of our programs on our news website, africaonair.com, and you can also follow us on all our social media channels. Also, feel free to share, like, and comment with the hashtag Initiative Africa. And don't forget, next week, same time, same channel, I'll see you again with a new edition of Business Africa. Wish you all a very happy New Year. Goodbye.